A Korean mafia boss pretends to be in a coma to test the faithfulness of the woman he loves, but when she leans over his corpse to whisper a shattering secret, the game turns deadly. The sterile chill of the VIP wing and the mechanical rhythmic pulse of the heart monitor were the only signs of life in a room that felt more like a tomb. To the world outside these soundproof glass walls, Kong Min-jae was a broken king, a legend reduced to a vegetable by a targeted strike that should have ended the Biko Syndicate's reign. He appeared powerless, a ghost drifting in a medicated void, but the reality was a cold, sharp calculation. Min-jae's mind was a razor in the dark, cutting through the silence. He had mastered the discipline of stillness, a technique learned in the shadows of his rise to power, keeping his pulse at a deathly crawl and enduring the biting humiliation of being handled like a man who could no longer feel. He lay there, a prisoner of his own making, paralyzed by the need to know who would remain when his power was gone. The suite was a cathedral of luxury, overflowing with orchids that held no scent for him and get-well wishes from men who had likely paid for the hit, but it was a cage monitored by his enemies. The soft click of a door and the rustle of a heavy silk gown signaled the arrival of the one variable he couldn't quantify. Kim Ha-yoon stepped into the room, her presence marked not by the scent of a nurse's antiseptic, but by the heavy morning fragrance of lilies. In her formal black lace and pearls, she looked like a tragic widow already prepared for a funeral that hadn't happened yet. Close behind her came the sound of polished leather, the heavy, confident stride of his lieutenants. They entered with the predatory grace of men who had already divided the spoils of his empire in their heads. They loomed over the bed, the heat of their betrayal radiating in the cool hospital air as they looked down at his unconscious form. Min-jae kept his eyes shut, his chest rising and falling in the shallow, deceptive rhythm of a man who was no longer there. He waited for the first word, the first lie, and the first sign of whether his lover was there to mourn him, or to finish him. The heavy double doors of the VIP suite groaned softly as they swung open, admitting a figure that seemed to pull the very light from the room. Kim Ha-yoon did not enter with the frantic energy of a grieving lover or the clinical efficiency of the medical staff. Instead, she moved with a ghostly rhythmic grace, the hem of her black lace gown sweeping over the linoleum like a dark tide. The intricate patterns of the lace climbed her throat, framing a face that was a mask of tragic concern, while the twin strands of pearls around her neck caught the sterile overhead glow, looking like drops of frozen light. To Kong Min-jae, lying beneath the suffocating weight of his calculated stillness, her arrival was marked first by the scent. It was the heavy, cloying fragrance of funeral lilies, a smell that signaled an ending. He kept his heart rate at its deathly, practiced crawl, even as the sound of her heels tapped out a lonely cadence toward his bedside. He could feel her presence looming over him, a shadow blocking the harsh fluorescent glare. "She's still wearing that dress," a voice rasped from the corner of the room. It was Park, one of the mid-level lieutenants whose ambition had always been louder than his intellect. "Does she think the boss is going to wake up and take her to the opera?" A low, guttural chuckle followed. "Let her play her part, Park. Every tragedy needs a beautiful widow. It keeps the press quiet and the transition looking respectable." Min-jae's mind, sharp and waiting behind the veil of his closed eyelids, recorded every syllable. He felt the heat of Ha-yoon's hand as she reached out, her fingers trembling as they brushed the skin of his forearm, avoiding the medical sensors and the nasal cannula. Her touch was cold, vibrating with a heavy moral burden that he couldn't yet decipher. Was it the weight of grief, or the friction of a secret tearing her apart from the inside? The lieutenants moved closer, their expensive Oxfords clicking with an arrogance that suggested they already owned the floor. They stood on the opposite side of the bed, looking at Ha-yoon not as a person, but as a decorative remnant of a dead man's life, a piece of fine furniture to be moved or discarded once the probate was settled. "Ha-yoon's sigh," Director Cho said, his voice a slippery cadence of false sympathy. "You've spent enough time in this tomb. The board is meeting tonight to discuss the stability of the syndicate. It would be best if you return to the villa. We have handled the arrangements for Min-jae's continued care." Ha-yoon didn't look up. She kept her eyes fixed on Min-jae's pale, immobile face. "I made a promise," she whispered, her voice thin and brittle like scorched paper. "I stay until the end." "The end has already happened, sweetheart," Park sneered, stepping forward to adjust his silk tie in the reflection of the cardiac monitor. "You're just staring at the echoes." He's a fallen titan, and the vultures don't like to be kept waiting for the feast. Min-jae endured the insult, his discipline of stillness absolute. He felt Hyun's grip tighten on his hand, her fingernails digging slightly into his palm, a hidden message or a subconscious plea for help. The lieutenants treated her silence as submission, a final confirmation that the woman who once stood at the right hand of the Biko king was now nothing more than a ghost in a black gown. They began to speak over her, discussing liquidation and territory shifts, as if she were as deaf as the man they believed was brain-dead. As they turned to leave, the air in the room remained thick with the scent of lilies and betrayal. Hyun remained, a dark silhouette against the white linens, her tragic gaze never wavering. Min-jae waited, his mind a razor in the dark, knowing that the real performance was only just beginning. The heavy door of the VIP suite hissed shut, sealing the room in a silence that felt like a physical weight. Hyun remained motionless for a moment, her hand still resting on Min-jae's cool skin, before she straightened her spine and stepped out into the dimly lit corridor. The shadows of the hallway seemed to lengthen as she walked, the rustle of her black lace gown sounding like a warning. She didn't get far before a hand gripped her elbow. It was Director Cho, his touch as slippery and unwelcome as his voice. Beside him stood Park, his face twisted into a smirk that suggested he had already spent the money he hadn't yet stolen. They led her into a small, windowless consultation room nearby, a place usually reserved for delivering bad news to grieving families. "Hyun sigh," Cho began, leaning against the edge of a sterile table. He didn't offer her a seat. "Let's dispense with the theater. You are a young woman with a long life ahead of you. It would be a tragedy to see that life cut short by a misplaced sense of loyalty to a man who is, for all intents and purposes, a ghost." Hyun clutched her pearls, her knuckles white. "He is still the head of the Biko syndicate." "He is a liability," Park snapped, pacing the small room like a caged animal. "The board is restless. The rivals are smelling blood in the water. We need a signature, Hyun. A transfer of power that keeps the empire from tearing itself apart." Cho reached into his breast pocket and produced a single sheet of paper, thick and expensive. He laid it on the table under the harsh glow of the LED lights. "We know about the debt, Hyun. The one your father left behind. The one the enemies of the syndicate are currently holding over your head like a guillotine." The air left Hyun's lungs. She looked at the paper, a legal document that would effectively strip Min-jae of everything he had built, handing the keys of the kingdom to the vultures standing before her. "We can make that debt vanish," Cho whispered, his eyes narrowing. "Sign for him. You've spent years watching him work. You know his hand better than anyone. Forge the signature on this transfer of power, and by tomorrow morning you will be free. No more black gowns, no more mourning, no more hiding in the shadows of a dying man." "And if I refuse?" Hyun's voice was barely a breath. Park stepped closer, his shadow falling over her. "Then the creditors will come for you. And trust me, they won't be as polite as we are. Min-jae can't protect you from a hospital bed. He's just a body taking up space. Why die for a man who can't even breathe on his own?" Hyun looked at the pen Cho was holding out to her. It was a heavy, gold-plated instrument, a tool of betrayal. The heavy moral burden she carried seemed to double in weight. She could feel the vultures circling, their ambition radiating in the cold air of the room. They weren't just asking for a signature. They were asking her to pull the plug on Min-jae's legacy while he was still warm. "I need time," she said, her voice trembling. "You have until midnight," Cho replied, his tone turning clinical. "The transfer must be filed before the markets open. Don't be foolish, Hyun. Choosing a dead man over your own survival is a romantic gesture the world won't remember." They left her alone in the cold room. Hyun looked at her reflection in the darkened glass of the door. A woman in a black gown, caught between a debt she couldn't pay and a man she couldn't betray. She turned and walked back toward the suite, her heels clicking a desperate rhythm. Behind the door of the VIP suite, Min-jae lay in the discipline of stillness, his mind a razor in the dark. He had heard the door close, heard the hushed tones of the hallway, and now he heard her return. He waited, paralyzed by choice, for the moment she would lean over him and reveal which side of the knife she had chosen. The clock on the wall of the VIP suite clicked toward midnight, the sound amplified by the oppressive stillness of the room. The metronomic beeping of the cardiac monitor felt like a countdown, a steady rhythmic pressure against the silence. Hyun sat in the low-slung chair by the bed, her black lace gown spilling onto the floor like a pool of ink. The tragic concern that had masked her face earlier had cracked, leaving behind something raw and exhausted. She reached out, her fingers trembling as they closed around Min-jae's hand. To the hidden cameras, she was merely a grieving lover holding onto a memory. To Min-jae, whose mind remained a razor in the dark, her touch was a conductor for the storm brewing inside her. He felt the cold dampness of her skin and the frantic, uneven pulse in her fingertips, the direct opposite of the discipline of stillness he forced upon his own body. "They came to me again, Min-jae," she whispered, her voice barely a ghost of a sound, vibrating with the heavy moral burden she had carried since the ambush. She leaned in closer, her forehead resting against the edge of the mattress, her breath warm against his immobile arm. "Director Cho and Park. They know. They've always known." Min-jae's heart rate didn't falter, but his focus sharpened to a lethal point. He listened to the soft, rhythmic sob she tried to swallow. "I never told you where I came from," she continued, the words spilling out in a trembling whisper of a confession. "Before I was yours, I was a debt. My father. He didn't just lose his money to the rivals, he lost me. They sent me to you, Min-jae. I was supposed to be the eyes inside your house, the one who found the weakness in the Biko King so they could strike." She let out a broken, hollow laugh that died in her throat. "But the more I watched you, the more I saw the man behind the Titan. I saw the way you carried the weight of 1,000 lives, and I forgot my purpose. I fell in love with my target. And now, they're using that love to finish what the ambush started." She lifted her head, her eyes blurred with tears that caught the blue light of the holographic displays. "They gave me a choice tonight. I forged your signature on the transfer of power, or they reveal my past to your loyalists and let the creditors take what's left of my life. If I sign, I kill your legacy. If I don't, I die with you." A single tear fell, landing on Min-jae's hand. He felt the salt and the warmth of it, a physical mark of her betrayal and her devotion. The vultures were no longer just circling. They were at the door, and the woman he had tested with a death sentence was currently choosing to drown with him rather than swim with them. "I'm so sorry," she breathed, her lips brushing his knuckles. "I wanted to be the one person who didn't want anything from you. But even my love is a weapon they're using against us. They're coming at dawn with a doctor to verify your decline. I don't know how to stop them without losing you." She collapsed back into the chair, her hand still anchored to his, her spirit seemingly broken by the weight of the secret. Behind the veil of his closed eyes, Min-jae felt a shift in his own internal architecture. The cynicism that had fueled his calculated deception began to erode. He had sought to find a traitor, but he had found a victim of the same game he played. The room remained clinical and cold, but the air was now charged with a new, dangerous electricity. Min-jae made a decision. He would no longer be a prisoner of his own making, paralyzed by choice. The test was over, and the time for the silent predator to strike back had arrived. The 3 a.m. chime of the hospital's automated system was followed by the clinical hiss of the pneumatic doors. Hyun's head snapped up, her eyes red-rimmed and hollow against the dark lace of her collar. A man entered, his white coat starched to a predatory stiffness that belied his profession. It was Dr. Park, a man whose medical license was merely a shield for the high-priced assassinations he performed under the guise of palliative care. Behind him loomed Director Cho, his eyes fixed on the leather-bound folder in Ha-Yun's lap. "The time for reflection has passed, Hain-sai," Cho said, his voice a slippery cadence that seemed to coat the sterile room in filth. "The board requires the signature. And the doctor here is concerned that Min-jae's agitation is increasing. He needs something to help him transition peacefully." Dr. Park didn't speak. He moved with the practiced efficiency of a butcher, reaching into his tray to produce a syringe filled with a clear, viscous liquid, the sedative that would turn Min-jae's faked coma into a permanent silence. The air in the suite grew heavy, the metronomic beeping of the monitor suddenly sounding like a frantic warning. Ha-Yun stood, her hand trembling as she clutched the pearls at her throat. "He isn't agitated. He's exactly the same. You said we had until dawn." "The market doesn't wait for the sun," Cho countered, stepping closer until he could smell the funeral lilies on her skin. "Sign the transfer, or the doctor administers the dose now. Either way, the Biko King is finished. You can choose to be a wealthy survivor or a penniless witness to a tragic medical accident." Min-jae lay beneath the white linens, his mind a razor in the dark. He felt the cold proximity of the doctor, the sharp scent of the chemical death held inches from his foreline. He heard the hitch in Ha-Yun's breath, the sound of a woman being crushed between her past and her heart. The discipline of stillness he had maintained for weeks screamed for release. He had heard enough. The test was over. As Dr. Park reached for the plastic port in the foretube, Ha-Yun let out a choked sob, reaching down to touch Min-jae's hand one last time, a silent goodbye before she surrendered to the vultures. In that heartbeat the world shifted. The hand that had been a corpse's weight for weeks suddenly surged with life. Before Ha-Yun could pull away, Min-jae's fingers snapped shut around her wrist. It wasn't the weak fumbling of a waking patient, it was the grip of the dead, cold, iron-strong and absolute. Ha-Yun gasped, her scream dying in her throat as she looked down. Min-jae's eyes were still closed, his face a mask of marble-like calm, but the strength in his hold was a violent revelation. He wasn't just awake. He was a predator who had finally decided to bite. Under the cover of the bedsheet, he used his thumb to pulse a rhythmic pressure against her skin. 3 short taps, then 1 long, a signal they had used in the early days of their romance to communicate in crowded rooms. "Trust me." The shock froze her in place. To Cho and the doctor, she simply looked like she was paralyzed by grief, her hand pinned to his by a phantom reflex. "Is there a problem, Ha-Yun?" Cho asked, his eyes narrowing as he sensed a change in the room's electricity. Ha-Yun felt the power radiating from Min-jae's hand, a silent command that flowed from his skin to hers. The heavy moral burden she carried suddenly felt lighter, replaced by the sharp adrenaline of a shared secret. She looked at Cho, her tragic mask hardening into something sharper, something dangerous. "No," she said, her voice finding a sudden, terrifying stability. "No problem at all. The doctor should proceed. I want to see exactly how you plan to care for him." Min-jae's grip tightened once more, a silent promise of the carnage to come, before his hand relaxed just enough to remain hidden, waiting for the perfect moment to shatter the vulture's world. The heavy silence of the VIP suite returned only after Director Cho and the doctor retreated, their footsteps echoing down the hall with the hollow confidence of men who believed they had already won. Inside the room, the tension shifted from a suffocating weight to an electric current. For the first time in weeks, Min-jae allowed his breathing to deepen, the discipline of stillness finally yielding to the necessity of action. He did not open his eyes immediately. The cameras were still a factor, but his voice, when it finally broke the silence, was a low, gravelly rasp that sounded like iron dragging over stone. "Do not look at my face, Ha-Yun. Look at the monitor. Keep your expression as it was." Ha-Yun let out a breath she seemed to have been holding for years. She obeyed, staring at the rhythmic, glowing lines of the heart monitor while her hand remained anchored in his. The grip of the dead had transformed into a tether of living fire. "You're awake," she whispered, her voice trembling not with fear now, but with the sheer shock of his return. "How long?" "Long enough to hear the vultures pick at my bones," Min-jae replied, his words precise and lethal. "And long enough to hear you, Hyun. Every word." A fresh tear tracked through the dark lace of her gown, but her posture remained rigid, playing the part of the grieving lover for any eyes watching the feed. "Then you know why I did it. You know the debt they hold. I know that you chose to drown with a corpse rather than swim with the rats," he said, and for a fleeting second, his thumb traced a gentle arc over her knuckles, the first honest gesture of affection in their shared history. "But the debt ends tonight. We are going to feed them the signature they want, but it will be a poison they cannot digest." The plan was forged in that shared shadow. Min-jae instructed her with the clinical coldness of a general. She was to return to Cho and Park, appearing broken and defeated. She would present the forged document, but hidden within the leather folder would be a microtransmitter Min-jae had secured from a loyalist before the ambush, a device currently taped to the underside of his bed frame. "You must go into the camp as my eyes and ears," Min-jae commanded, his voice barely a vibration in the air. "They will take you to the secure server room at the headquarters to finalize the transfer. That is where the digital ledger is kept, the one Cho has been using to launder the syndicate's blood money into his own accounts. I need the encryption key they use for the final authorization." Hyun's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic rhythm that contrasted with Min-jae's steady pulse. "They'll kill me if they find it. Park is already suspicious." "They won't find it because they see you as a decorative remnant," Min-jae said, his tone hardening with a protective edge. "To them you are a tragic girl in a black gown, a girl too weak to fight back. Use that. Let them underestimate the woman who stood by the Biko king." He released her hand slowly, the loss of contact feeling like a sudden chill. "Go. Sign their paper. Let them celebrate their victory. By the time they realize the crown is made of glass, I will be standing behind them." Hyun stood up, smoothing the lace of her dress and wiping her eyes. She looked in the mirror, adjusting her pearls until the heavy moral burden was tucked neatly behind a mask of cold, tragic resolve. She didn't look back at the bed as she walked toward the door. She didn't need to. For the first time since the ambush, she wasn't walking alone. Behind her, Min-jae returned to his stillness, his mind once again a razor in the dark, watching the door close as his lover stepped out to play the most dangerous game of her life. The headquarters of the Biko syndicate loomed over the city like a monolith of glass and cold ambition. Inside the obsidian-walled conference room, the air was thick with the scent of expensive tobacco and the silent, predatory tension of men who had spent their lives waiting for a king to fall. Hyun stood at the periphery of the long granite table, her black lace gown a sharp contrast to the sea of gray and charcoal suits. She felt like a dark omen, but to the council members she was merely a decorative remnant, a fragile ghost whose presence was tolerated only until the ink on the documents was dry. Director Cho sat at the head of the table, the leather folder containing the poisoned signature laid out before him like a trophy. Beside him, Park leaned back, his eyes scanning the room with a restless, hungry energy. "The transition is nearly complete," Cho announced, his voice carrying that slippery corporate cadence of betrayal. "With this final authorization, the Biko holdings will be restructured. The old methods died with Min-jae's consciousness. Tomorrow we move the capital." Hyun moved slowly, her heels making no sound on the deep pile carpet. Her hand trembled as she reached out to straighten a stack of files near the central hub of the room's communication system, a sleek, integrated terminal that managed the building's secure encryption. Beneath the lace of her sleeve, the microtransmitter Min-jae had provided felt like a hot coal against her skin. "Why is she still here?" Park snapped, his gaze landing on Hyun. "The girl has done her part. Send her back to the villa before she starts leaking tears all over the ledger." "She stays," Cho replied smoothly, though his eyes remained cold. "She is the face of the mourning period. Her presence legitimizes the transfer in the eyes of the lower tiers." Hyun lowered her head, playing the role of the broken, submissive lover. "I only wish to see my father's debts cleared as promised," she whispered, her voice brittle. As the men turned their attention to a digital map of the syndicate's offshore accounts, Hyun saw her opening. She leaned against the console, her fingers deftly sliding the small adhesive bug into the recessed seam of the primary data port. For a heartbeat, the device wouldn't seat properly. She felt a bead of sweat track down her neck, the heavy moral burden of her past threatening to crush her focus. "Is there a problem, Hainsai?" Park's voice was suddenly right behind her. She froze, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm that echoed the metronomic beeping of the hospital room she had just left. She turned slowly, her hand dropping to her side, concealing the empty space where the transmitter had been. She looked up at him, her eyes wide and brimming with tragic concern. I felt dizzy," she breathed, clutching her pearls. "The scent of the cigars. It reminds me of the villa. Of before." Park studied her for a long, agonizing moment, searching for a spark of the razor in the dark he had expected from a woman at Min Jae's side. He found only a girl in a black gown, seemingly crushed by the weight of her grief. He let out a dismissive grunt and turned back to the table. "Get her some water. And tell the security team to prepare the server room. We authorize the final transfer in 10 minutes. Hyun stepped back, her legs feeling like water. The bug was active. She could feel a faint vibration in the receiver hidden in her ear, the sound of the vultures circling their own demise. She had survived the lion's den, but the most dangerous part of the game was yet to come. Somewhere across the city, in a quiet VIP suite, she knew Min Jae was listening, his mind already weaving the net that would catch every man in this room. The predator's patience had run thin. Within the hour of the council meeting, the vultures had abandoned the dawn timeline, sensing the shifting air. Hyun found herself ushered back into the VIP suite, her black gown rustling frantically as she was flanked by Cho and Park. The room felt smaller now, the metronomic beeping of the monitor sounding like a drumbeat in a death march. Dr. Park was already there, his starched white coat a jarring contrast to the dim blue light of the holographic displays. In his hand, he held a new syringe, its contents shimmering with a lethality that needed no explanation. The poison chalice was no longer a metaphor. It was a physical reality inches from the man who had built the very walls around them. "The board decided that the transition needs to be absolute," Director Cho said, his slippery cadence now sharpened by a cold finality. He held out the leather folder, the forged signature visible on the top page. "Your signature is the key, Insai. But the doctor's intervention is the lock. Once this is administered, there will be no more echoes. No more ghosts." Hyun stood at the foot of the bed, her hand clutching the pearls at her throat until the wire bit into her skin. Her tragic concern was no longer a mask. It was a visible tremor that threatened to undo her. She looked at Min Jae, who lay in his discipline of stillness, his face a frozen sculpture of marble. To anyone else he was a fallen titan. To her he was a coiled spring, a hidden power waiting for the spark. "He isn't in pain," she whispered, her voice a brittle fragment of sound. "Why now?" "Because a king who might wake up is a king who can still execute traitors," Park sneered, stepping closer to the bed. He looked down at Min Jae with a look of pure, unadulterated hunger. "We're doing him a favor. We're letting him die while he's still a legend, instead of a vegetable." Dr. Park moved toward the foreport, his fingers gloved in latex that squeaked against the plastic tubing. He began to purge the air from the needle, a single toxic drop beading at the tip. Hyun felt the heavy moral burden of her secret knowledge pressing against her lungs. She had planted the bug, she had delivered the signal, but now she was forced to stand witness to the very murder she had been blackmailed to assist. "Sign the final witness form, Hyun," Cho commanded, thrusting a pen toward her. "Witness that his heart stopped of natural causes. Witness the end of the Biko era." Her eyes darted to Min Jae's hand, hidden beneath the white linens. She remembered the grip of the dead from the night before, the iron strength that had promised her a revolution. She saw the doctor's hand descend toward the catheter. The air in the room seemed to freeze. Hyun realized that the enemies weren't just moving the execution forward. They were celebrating a victory they hadn't yet secured. They were so focused on the corpse that they had forgotten the predator. "I won't sign," she said, her voice suddenly finding a terrifying resonant depth. Cho paused, his eyes narrowing into slits. "You have no choice, girl. The debt is paid," she interrupted, her gaze fixed on the doctor's needle, which was now a hair's breadth from the port. She saw Min-jae's chest rise in a slow, deep breath, not the shallow, practiced rhythm of the coma, but the expansive inhalation of a man preparing for a strike. The holographic monitors flickered, a glitch caused by the microtransmitter she had planted, and for a split second, the heart rate on the screen flatlined, sending a false signal of death to the nursing station. "Do it now," Cho hissed at the doctor. Hyun didn't scream. She didn't look away. She watched the needle enter the rubber seal, and she waited for the world to shatter. The needle pierced the rubber port, a silver flash of impending death. Dr. Park's thumb hovered over the plunger, prepared to deliver the final lethal shove. But the vegetative state that had defined the room for weeks shattered in a single violent heartbeat. Before the doctor could depress the syringe, Min-jae's hand shot out from beneath the white linens like a viper. His fingers clamped around Dr. Park's wrist with a sickening crunch of bone, the strength so absolute it was as if the fallen titan had been forged of iron while he slept. A strangled cry escaped the doctor as the syringe was wrenched from his grasp and driven deep into the mattress, away from the four-line. Min-jae sat up in one fluid, terrifying motion. The nasal cannula was ripped away, and the medical sensors were cast aside like useless trinkets. His eyes, which the world believed would never see light again, snapped open. They were not the eyes of a recovering patient. They were the cold, predatory eyes of a king who had returned from the underworld to collect his debts. "The transition is cancelled, Cho," Min-jae rasped. His voice a low-register growl that seemed to vibrate the very glass of the VIP suite. Director Cho stumbled back, his face draining of color until it matched the sterile walls. Park's hand went for the weapon tucked into his waistband, but he froze. From the hidden recesses of the suite and the corridors beyond, the heavy, rhythmic thud of tactical boots erupted. The pneumatic doors hissed open, and the vultures found themselves staring into the barrels of high-caliber rifles. "Drop it," a voice commanded. It was Attorney Kong, flanked by a phalanx of the syndicate's most loyal guards, men whose silence had been bought not with bribes, but with a decades-long devotion to the man now sitting on the bed. Behind them, the flickering blue lights of the police tactical units bathed the hallway in a chaotic strobe of justice. You were awake," Cho stammered, his slippery cadence finally reduced to a pathetic whimper. "The monitor. The decline. A digital ghost," Min-jae said, his gaze shifting to Hyun, who stood as a dark, resolute pillar in her black lace gown. "Provided by the woman you believed was too weak to fight back." Min-jae stood, his stature commanding despite the hospital gown. He walked toward Cho with a slow, measured pace that promised no mercy. The microtransmitter Hyun had planted at the headquarters had done its work. The police held every recording, every forged signature, and every confession uttered in the tomb of silence. "You thought the crown was up for auction," Min-jae said, looming over the man who had been his legal counsel. "But you forgot that a crown is only as strong as the head that wears it." Park and Cho were forced to their knees, their wrists bound in plastic zip ties as the authorities swarmed the room to secure the evidence. The poisoned chalice was bagged as a murder weapon, and the doctor was led away in a state of shock. In the center of the swirling chaos, Min-jae turned to Hyun. The heavy moral burden that had bowed her shoulders for weeks seemed to evaporate as their eyes met. He didn't offer a celebratory smile. Instead, he bowed his head slightly, a rare, profound gesture of archaic honor from a Mafia boss to a civilian. "The test is over," he whispered, his voice solely for her. Hyun reached out, her fingers no longer trembling as they touched the arm of the man she had saved. The metronomic beeping of the monitor had ceased, replaced by the sound of a city waking up to a new era. The Biko king had risen, but as he looked at the woman in the black gown, it was clear that he had not returned to reclaim his throne alone. The transition was not a retreat, but a systematic demolition of a world that had become too small for the truth. In the weeks following the resurrection, the darkness of the syndicate was systematically dismantled, not by a rival gang, but by the very man who had once been its apex predator. Min-jae moved with a clinical, lethal efficiency to liquidate the Biko Empire, transforming its blood-soaked assets into legitimate foundations and transparent enterprises. He understood that to protect Hyun, he had to destroy the environment where she was a target. They stood together on the balcony of a quiet villa overlooking the Han River, far from the sterile VIP suites and the obsidian walls of the headquarters. The heavy, oppressive scent of funeral lilies had been replaced by the crisp, biting air of a Seoul winter. Min-jae was no longer dressed in the hospital gray of a victim or the sharp charcoal of a Mafia king. He wore a simple, dark overcoat, his posture relaxed for the first time in a decade. The final transfers were completed this morning, Min-jae said. His voice no longer a gravelly rasp but a steady, resonant anchor. The shipping routes, the high-interest debt, the shadow accounts, they've all been turned over to the authorities or dissolved into the charitable trust. Hyun stood beside him, her black lace gown finally traded for a soft cashmere sweater of ivory. The heavy moral burden that had once threatened to snap her spine had evaporated, replaced by a quiet, burgeoning peace. She looked out at the city lights, no longer seeing a grid of territories to be conquered, but a home to be lived in. "You gave it all away," she whispered, turning to look at him. "Everything you spent your life building." "I didn't give it away, Hyun. I traded it for something with a higher valuation," he replied, his gaze fixing on her with a warmth that the silent predator would never have allowed. "The syndicate was a fortress, but it was also a cage. I spent years in the discipline of stillness because I didn't trust anyone enough to move. I don't want to be a ghost anymore." The news on the tablet nearby flickered with headlines of the Biko Reformation, detailing how record-low crime rates followed the syndicate's transition into a lawful tech and logistics consortium. The world saw a corporate miracle, but Hyun knew the truth. It was a confession of love written in the language of power. Min-jae had dismantled a kingdom to ensure that no one could ever use her past against her again. The debt was not just paid. The ledger was burned. "What happens now?" she asked, her hand sliding into his. This time there was no grip of the dead, only the gentle, firm pressure of a man who was fully present. "Now we build something that doesn't require a mask," Min-jae said. He looked toward the horizon, where the sun was beginning to bleed amber and gold over the water. "I have a lot of cleaning up to do, and you have a life that doesn't involve mourning a living man. We've been paralyzed by choice for too long. Today we choose the light." The metronomic beeping that had defined their shared history was gone, replaced by the natural, uneven rhythm of a city in motion and the steady heartbeat of a woman who had saved a king from himself. As they stepped back into the warmth of the villa, the cameras were gone, the vultures were in cages, and the fallen titan was finally, undeniably free. The story of the coma and the confession was over. The story of Min-jae and Hyun was just beginning.